Hi, this will be a series of videos on creating a library of code that works with an internet API. We're going to use the Open Weather Map API for the example, but you could apply this to any API. The idea here is to look at how we can wrap up code in the same way that you see these packages on NPM. So, you can download a package and you can call methods or use objects within that package without actually having to write the code yourself, and you don't have to know what's in the package. You just have to know what the what the documentation says about it, right? So why don't we start by actually just writing the code ourselves, and then that way we can take the code we've written, turn it into a library, and kind of see what the difference is between code that you just write and use versus code that you package up for use in any situation, right? I'm going to get started by taking a look at the Open Weather Map API. So here I've got Open Weather Map. It's a service that provides weather data, to 2 million customers and 20 plus weather APIs, right? 2,000 new subscribers a day. So, it's pretty popular. They have an okay API. It works pretty good. I think that we can improve on it if we write a package for it, right? In order to use it, though, you'll need to sign in. So you have to create an account and then sign in. And when you sign in, you'll be able to go look at their API, and you can check your account and get an API key. And that's kind of a key thing that we need, right? So I'm going to go to API keys right here, and I'm going to grab my API key, right? So I'll copy that, and then I'm going to go to my desktop here and make a folder. I'm going to call it Weather API. How about that, right? And then I'll open this in Visual Studio Code. Let me actually close that and open it again here. There we go, right? And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make just kind of a naive version of our project. We'll just make the simplest possible project with the simplest possible code, and then we'll improve on that, okay? So we'll need a file here, and probably an HTML file. So you're going to probably write code that works with the API, and you're going to display the data in the web, right? So I'll put this here. And then, maybe I'll add some boilerplate HTML here. So I'll have the, the head tag, the title tag, and the body tag. Okay, so that's pretty good. And then maybe down here at the end of the body tag, I'll need a script tag. And in the script tag at the bottom here, let's paste our API key just for the moment, right? And what are we going to do? Well, in order to use this, we need to understand what kind of endpoint that Open Weather Map provides, right? So let's go back to their site and look at their API documentation. So they have an API that provides several different types of forecasts. So we can have the current weather data, we can have hourly forecast, 16-day forecast, climate forecast for 30 days, and some other ones, right? Let's start with this very first one, the current weather data. Okay, so I'll click on the API doc, and then they're going to show us some API calls that we can make. So we can make, API weather map org 2.5, and we can call it by the city name. We can call it by city name and country code. And then we can also call the API with a city ID. And we can also include latitude and longitude over here and do it that way. I think it takes zip code. Oh yeah, here's zip code too. So we can call it from any one of these with any one of these parameters, right? But the basic API call is let's try the city name one right here, right? Actually, I kind of like zip code. Maybe zip code's a better one, right? So let's start with that one. So I'll scroll down to zip code, and let's click on a sample API call right here. So if I click on this, it'll load some JSON data. And so this is what they return to us. So if we call their API with a city code, they'll give us something like this. And what did we call it with here? Well, I guess they called it with latitude and longitude. I kind of wanted, that's a zip code. Well, I guess it gives us, maybe they called it with the zip code and it still includes the latitude and longitude, right? Country US, name Mountain View, right? So I guess this is the location right here, right? So anyway, so that's the data. And if you look at the address up here, this is a little different than what they show in their API because they have this samples subdomain, right? So we're going to call it from the API.OpenWeatherMap subdomain, but the rest of this is going to be the same. And if you look on the end here, you can see they include an API key with the key value of API ID, and then they include zip code, and then they follow it with the zip code, right? And then the country code, right? So let's borrow this. And let's try and make a sample API call that works for us. So I'm going to paste this into here. And if I recall, their API here actually begins with api.openweathermap.org, right? So that's a little different than their sample code, right? So I'm going to change this to api.openweathermap, okay? So let's just try and make an API call. So I'm going to make a path variable, and I'll wrap this line in the back quote, right? So I'm using the back quote. It's up to the left of the number 1. And then this is our API ID, or my API ID, right? You'll use your own. And I'm going to make another variable right here called API key. Actually, let's just call it API. Yeah, let's call it API key, right? And I'll paste my API key here. And then on the next line below, let's insert the, actually, let's define a variable for the zip code also. So we'll call it zip, and we'll set this equal to 94010. We'll just make that a string, right? And we'll insert the zip code here, right? So it should say zip equals, and then I'll put zip code in there. And then we can take out, I think if I take out the comma US, it'll still work. And then this ampersand API ID, this is followed by the API ID, right? So I'll take that out, and then I'll replace it with my variable, right? So I'll put this here, and now we're kind of ready to go, right? So let's give it a try. So we'll use fetch, and I'm going to write a call to fetch here, and we'll put the path in, and then we'll say .then. And fetch will give us a response. And what we're going to do is we're going to return that response, but we're going to call .json on the response. And we're going to return a promise here that says that we want to stream the data as JSON. And then on that promise, we'll call .then again. And here we'll handle the JSON response. So I'll put JSON in here. So let me kind of rearrange the code here. Just maybe we're going to rewrite this a little bit later too. So I'm going to write it like this. There we go. Maybe that's a little easier to read, right? So I've got fetch, and then I'm going to include my path, and then I've got .then, and I've got a function, a callback here that I'm going to pass to then, and it's going to receive a response object. And then from that response, I'm going to call JSON to indicate that I want to stream my data via JSON, and this will return another promise. So on that promise, we'll call .then, include a callback, and that callback will receive the JSON that we streamed here. right? And then we can console log the JSON data, right? And in case there's an error, we can include a .catch on the end, and this would receive an error object, and we can console log that error. Well, actually, let's do error.message, right? Okay, so there we go. So we've got fetch, we're going to stream the data, we're going to receive some JSON, we're going to log our JSON, and catch any errors that show up, right? So this is in the HTML page, so we can just open this in the browser. So this is kind of like our naive approach, right? We're just starting here, okay? And let's open up our page and see what it looks like. So I'm going to grab this thing and drag it on my browser right here. So that's my index.html, right? And I'll inspect it. And let's see here. Oh, look, it looks like it worked, right? So this says something else, but that's not us, right? But down here, I've got an object. Let's actually zoom in on that a little bit, right? And if I open this object up, it says base stations, clouds, COD 200. The Open Weather Map API, they give you this COD, and that's essentially like a code that says whether your request was accepted or not. So 200 is okay. It would say 404 if you couldn't find your address or something, right? Or 500 if their server was down or some problem was on their end, right? So anyway, so here's the data. Temperature is 287. Actually, that's kind of weird. This is in Kelvin. So there's actually another option that we can put on the end here called units, and we can say that we want to get data in imperial units, that's like Fahrenheit, or in metric units, which would be Celsius, right? We'll add that later. So they got our base station from Burlingame. Visibility is whatever that number means, right? Wind speed is this. So everything is working, right? So that's pretty good. But this isn't super great. Like, how can we work with this, right? So maybe our first step is to wrap this all in a function, right? So this looks pretty good. So why don't we create a function that can do this? Because, if we have the code here and it's just sitting in the script tag, we'll load the page and the code will run one time. But what we need to do is we need to run this code over and over again. And we need to be able to tell it what the zip code is and what the API key is, and maybe some other information like the units that we want. So let's create a function. I'm going to make a function. It'll say get weather. And then I'll take everything here and move it into my function. Okay, so that's pretty good. So now I can call the function, right? So maybe at the bottom here, I'll say get weather, right? And, this zip code, API key, and the path will be fixed, but these two things could come from outside. So maybe I could move the zip code up here, and the API key can also be a parameter, right? And that means these two things can go, but what we'll need to do is we'll need to pass them in here in this function. So I'll paste them outside, and then here I can call get weather with the zip and the API key. Okay, so let's give that a try, right? So that should just work the same way. Maybe I'll change the zip code here. Let's make it 941012. I don't know where that is, right? But we'll just experiment, right? So I'll refresh over here. It takes a second. Oh wait, city not found. So maybe that's a zip code that doesn't exist. Let's go 122. Maybe that one exists, right? We'll refresh again. Oh yeah, so that one exists. So I picked a zip code that doesn't exist. Hey, so that kind of works, right? So anyway, so that's pretty good. So now let's imagine like this is pretty good, but if you had an app you were working on, you wanted to maybe include the code that does the weather or gets the weather data, but you don't want to write it into your page. So what we might do is we might take all of this code and move it into a file, right? So I'll take all this out of here. Actually, this stuff would stay here, but this function would go into that file, and then we could just call that function from the file, right? So I'm going to cut that out of here. I've got it on the clipboard, and then I'll make a new file and save it into my folder here. Let's call this like Weather API.js, and then I'll just paste all of my code in here. And if I go back to my first file, I'll include another script tag, and then I can say source equals Weather API JS. So now, as long as I import this first, then I can call on the function in here from the code here. So now we're getting somewhere. It's kind of an improvement. Still pretty naive, but it's improved, right? Because I could just include Weather API JS with any project now. Like I could copy that file, I could give it to someone else, I could share it with my team members, right? And then they could just call it. All they have to write is this code, and they're going to need to write these things in, right? Okay, so let's give that a try. So let's refresh it here. Seems like it's still working. Let's try another random zip code. What about 011? I don't know. I'm going to give it a try. Hey, it worked, right? So anyway, so that's kind of working, right? So why don't you think about this and think of some questions like how would you use this, or how could you improve on it, right? And then we'll continue in the next video.